Hi everyone, I'm Renee Sharon, Director of Content Development for AIPAC AIEF Israel. Today I'm honored to be joined by national security expert Helit Barel. Helit is the former Executive Director of the Council for Peace and Security and a former Director at the Israel National Security Council. Her expertise extends to foreign policy, nuclear proliferation, and U.S.-Israel relations. Helit is also a founding member of the Devorah Forum, an organization promoting women in foreign policy and national security. Helit, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So let's dive right in. We have a lot to talk about, but before we get into that, I want to hear about you and your story. Tell us about yourself and how you ended up on this career path.
Well, as you said, I have been involved in national security policy in various forms, inside the government, outside of the government, lobbying, and so on. But it all started just in my personal interest and the understanding at a very young age of how important these issues were for the state of Israel. So it was a natural path for me to pursue through my studies, which also brought me to the United States. And after my graduate studies in the U.S., I stayed over in Washington for working for a bit to understand the mechanisms of government in Washington, then headed back to Israel to be one of the first people involved in the Israeli National Security Council in the early 2000s. But other than just the dry career stuff, I feel it's always been my path to move between the United States and Israel. My mother is American. She made Aliyah and married my father in 1967, right before the war. Then I lived in the States for a while, and my first child was born in the U.S. I have many, many friends and family there, and both on a personal level and on a policy level, I've always found it kind of a personal mission to be a bridge between these very close allies that still need to learn how to talk to each other even after so long.
Well, that's something that we at AIPAC can definitely appreciate.
Absolutely.
So I want to dive into your area of expertise. Could you lay out for us, what are the most significant strategic security threats facing Israel today?
So I would divide the issue into two. One is threats to the existence of the nation, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And the other is a threat to the nature of the existence of Israel. And what I mean by that is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I would say that is a threat, not so much in terms of security capabilities because of the real substantial gap between capabilities, but it is a threat to how we view ourselves. It is a great dispute within Israeli society, as you know. It's a great dispute for Israel and its international relations. So it's more a threat to the nature of the society and its existence, and one that has to be dealt with. The other forms of threat are threats that are more security, not that the Palestinian issue doesn't have various security elements to it, of course it does, but to actually be able to threaten the existence of the nation. There we're looking at very different threats, and in particular, obviously, the threat from Iran, both regionally, conventionally, and on the nuclear level, where Iran is working very hard to create bases very close to Israel, and obviously on a nuclear military program. Now, Israel is obviously not the only target of Iranian activity, but we are talking currently about threats to Israel. So threats are coming from Iran, and in particular, ballistic missiles, weapons of mass destruction, but also the use of proxies and terrorism to interfere inside the nation and to get through the borders and to activate others, such as the threat we all speak about from Hezbollah and missiles posed in Lebanon, deployed in Lebanon, conventional missiles, but nevertheless a very important threat to contend with, all of which is fueled by Iran. We saw the Iranian role in Syria. So we're seeing threats particularly from that region.
Yeah, and you know, Israelis are acutely aware of the threat along our border in the form of Iranian proxies, Hamas down in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, like you mentioned, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Iran in Syria. It's something that we feel and hear about and think about all the time. Can you kind of give us an overview of what the Israeli security apparatus is thinking about these threats and how the country is planning to confront them?
Well, I think the Israeli security apparatus obviously has its debates, and you won't find just one voice. But I do think, analyzing in a general way, the conventional threat is a threat that Israel has been contending with very well. So the ability to get in those strongholds that Iran is trying to found in areas of Syria and in areas of Lebanon and deal with them operationally and militarily has been demonstrated to be very successful and something that Israel is also able to do in terms of international legitimacy, working around some very, very sticky situations between Russia and the international community and the question of are civilians involved. So it's been a very precise effort, and I feel that it's been successful. Of course, it's not over. It's like gardening. It's an ongoing thing. It will be there for the long haul because the Iranian motivation is there for the long haul, and it's a very, very active scene. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there's other scenes going on, such as the cyber warfare, really, between Israel and Iran. And attacks have been attributed to Israel and attacks have been attributed to Iran. The Israeli ones so far have been more successful, but that is a very, very heated kind of arena, and it affects a lot of the other conventional, actually kinetic elements of this conflict with Iran. So that's another important scene. And of course, lately we've seen a very strong awakening on the issue of terrorism. So the issue around Turkey and the attempts of the Iranians, the IRGC, to create some sort of success story in Turkey by abducting Israelis or harming Israelis as a response to what they claim is Israeli assassinations of top people such as Fakhrizadeh from the nuclear program and others, which have not been acknowledged by Israel. But irrespective, that's another, it's not necessarily a territorial front, but there's a front going on really globally on that level where Israeli intelligence is extremely active. So I feel like Israel's response on the conventional level require a lot of work and a lot of effort, but are very successful. And it's very, very key to maintain the support Israel gets internationally for being able to maintain these efforts. So in other words, for example, no matter what happens in nuclear negotiations with Iran, that Israel's freedom of action regionally, conventionally is maintained, and that's what's been happening. I think that's a very key element.
Yeah, and I think that this unfortunately comes from the fact that Israel has had so much experience in these types of things, and we've become quite good at it, at keeping our people safe and knowing what we need to do in order to maintain our security.
Absolutely, and also the motivation is not something you can go wrong on. It's right in Syria, it's right in Lebanon. These are not any kind of locations that are acceptable to Israel. I don't think anybody should expect any nation to have these kind of threats thriving right at its borders and not respond. And I think that's what we're seeing. But I have to say again, Israel, of course, is not the only country that is suffering from these Iranian efforts. Saudi Arabia, we have seen attacks and missile attacks and proxies and terrorism, and we've seen, the involvement in Yemen, and we've seen Iranian involvement in many, many places. And so Israel is certainly one that responds very effectively, but not all the other nations can or do.
Yeah, and it's really a pervasive influence, and that's a perfect segue to my next question. I want to talk to you about the nuclear issue.
Of course.
The nuclear issue in Iran is without a doubt the most severe threat to the region. Tell us why the regime insists on maintaining this program despite the sanctions that they face. And more than that, I want to ask you to illustrate for us, what would it mean for the region to have a nuclear Iran?
Well, the question of the regime's motivations is obviously very complicated, and you would get many different answers for it. From an Iranian perspective, they never acknowledge that they are pursuing a military capability, but when you look into it and you explore it, voices have been heard, pretty early on, especially in the aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war, that discuss how traumatic that war had been for Iran and the use of chemical weapons by Iraq and the sense in Iran that the world would not come to their rescue and that some sort of deterrent was necessary to offset at least the Iraqi threat. But then there are other explanations as well, such as creating a deterrent from the United States, exercising its presence in the region. And certainly we have had, whether you believe those or think they're empty rhetorics, plenty of threats vis-a-vis Israel, referring to the nuclear capability, to Iranian potential nuclear capability. They never say it in in those kind of words, but discussing annihilation and things of the sort, referring to that. So you can choose, the motivation. Ultimately, most people think that the regime sees it as imperative for its own survival, and that's why the pursuit is so unrelenting. Mind you, we have to remember that it's a very long-term effort for them. So we have to remember situations like 2003, where they halted their enrichment project then because the United States had invaded Iraq. And when you have the United States right next door, all of a sudden, your payoff structure changes and you don't necessarily accelerate your program. So it's not inevitable that they're going on this path and it could never be reversed in my mind, but there's a very strong motivation there. So that's, that is why I don't expect we were going to see Iran voluntarily or in any kind of easy terms reverse its nuclear program or even freeze it or, contend or accept, any real long-term kind of terms to forfeit this nuclear military effort. Now, what it means for the region is very, very far-reaching. First of all, we have to understand that when a country crosses the nuclear threshold or even goes close to the nuclear threshold. That is, let's say there's a scenario where Iran decides to stop shy of crossing the nuclear threshold, but everybody knows that within 3 months, 6 months, whatever it is, it can create a nuclear capacity and deploy nuclear weapons. That already changes the dynamics dramatically. And what we have also seen in history, and it's very important to remember, both in the Cold War between the United States and then the Soviet Union and India and Pakistan, is that these early phases of the creation of a nuclear relationship or the crossing of a nuclear line emboldens the state that crosses that line very much. So the calculus could be, this is some sort of umbrella. This creates some sort of immunity for us to, for example, increase activity in Lebanon because there's a level to which the Israelis / the Americans, whoever, won't escalate because they want to avoid a nuclear war. And let me remind you what's going on in Ukraine right now. And one of the main reasons why things are evolving the way they are is that Russia is a nuclear power. So it does create some sort of extreme. Now, the threat specifically to Israel has been discussed endlessly. There are also discussions about the question of whether nuclear deterrence can work the way it has worked in other cases, such as India, Pakistan, and the Cold War. Those are all discussions that can be had, but they still don't address the issue of what happens in the region. And what happens in the region is what we're already seeing. That is, Iran doesn't need to cross a nuclear threshold in order for there to be a real domino effect in the attempt of other nations in pursuit of their own security interests, trying to obtain their own nuclear deterrent capability, which they don't have. And in particularly, when the perception is that the United States is pivoting to Asia and that whole scene, which whether or not it is actually founded and correct, is a perception that is very prevalent. And so nations have been for a while now, this isn't new, looking at a nuclear option for themselves, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Turkey, Egypt, and others. And if there's one thing that we can't discuss and talk about and imagine is what a nuclear Middle East would look like, that's nowhere that we can afford to go. Not Israel, not the region, not the world. But it is very important to contend with it because leaving Middle Eastern countries to their own devices, say, okay, contend with a nuclear Iran or what they are convinced will be a nuclear Iran, isn't going to work. So either you convince them that Iran really will not go nuclear and put your weight behind that, you provide security assurances to contend with such a scenario, and you address the issue to create a structure that prevents further proliferation in the Middle East.
So, Helit, based on all of that, what you just said, how is Israel utilizing its new relationships with the Sunni Arab world in order to create kind of a tougher front against Iran?
Right. Well, I think the key element of contending with Iran is that none of these nations do this on their own. And we have seen a real turn of events with the signing of the Abraham Accords, and not just with the signing of the Accords, but the dynamic that it brought with it. So in other words, what followed, we saw the Negev Forum, and we're seeing now explicit discussions about some sort of architecture, regional architecture, that is specifically a defense architecture, it's a security architecture, and something that would be formalized and something that clearly is to offset and balance the Iranian influence in the region. Now, how far that will proceed without key players such as Saudi Arabia is an important question. It's very important to understand that there's a key role also for the United States in this, in promoting this. Israel, absolutely, regionally, is taking a very active part, and the results so far have been really positive. Hopefully we will see something materialize, but this requires further movement. And I think with the renewed understanding of the continued, maybe unfortunately, but the truth is the continued dependence on oil from the Gulf, that this is an interest that cannot at this stage just be shifted aside. It needs to be addressed in a very energetic manner, and stamina is required to continue this path that Israel and some of the moderate Arab states are on, to enhance it and to turn it something that is a true policy tool and of value specifically to offset the Iranian threat in the region.
Well, keeping all of this in mind and understanding all of these really challenging security threats on Israel's doorstep, could you tell us how the U.S. and Israel is working together to prevent Iranian aggression in the region, and not only just in the region, but really globally?
Yes, well, Israel and the United States do remain very close allies, and that's, you know, a very, very important asset, both for Israel and for the United States. And I think it is very well manifested in collaborative efforts such as Iron Dome, for example. So as you must all know, Iron Dome is an Israeli initiative, but very substantially backed by the United States, and has been deployed and had great operational success in Israel against Katyusha rockets, as I'm sure you're all aware of. But the interesting thing is, it is also very imperative for the United States. So the United States had advanced this project a lot and procured batteries of Iron Dome, and had also deployed them in Guam for a while for basically part of its own layered missile defense effort, specifically theater high-altitude missile defense. It's important to understand that missile defense has layers. So this is one of those important layers, whereas there are not really, for the United States and Guam, for example, there's not really a threat of Katyusha rockets, but Iron Dome can also serve against UAVs. It can also serve against cruise missiles. So this is very much a joint interest. It's a joint interest in addition to being, you know, a great product of a close alliance.
Absolutely, and I know that you kind of had a first-hand experience with a lot of these things when you lived in the United States. You worked with Congress on some of these matters, these collaborative defense projects between the United States and Israel. Can you give us kind of a behind-the-scenes report or overview about what that experience was like? These
are the good things to be involved in. These are the projects that, you know, there's really no disagreement about why something is necessary and why something will work. So another one of those examples that I believe will also be very strongly backed by the United States, and Congress will go along with it, because it's important to understand that there is still in Congress, you know, a strong understanding of how this works for the United States as well. You always have various voices, but the question is what happens in the end, and I think ultimately the next stage of this, for example, is developing the laser missile defense. And the laser missile defense, while it's not ready yet and it's not deployed, we're a few years away, has just the most immense potential, because it's important to understand that the laser missile defense works, it's unlimited ammunition, right? Iron Domes uses missiles that are very expensive to shoot down the adversary's missiles. This is laser beams. Laser beams, you don't have to pay per laser beam, right? So it's unlimited ammunition, and cost is very important. This is where it comes back to the United States. It's very important because the United States, no less than Israel, and even more so, looks like it will be facing the kind of adversaries that use these low-cost things such as UAVs and lower-cost missiles and robotics in swarms, in quantities. So the ability to deal with them with something that's laser-based, for example, energy-based, is immensely important. Now, whatever happens with this particular laser effort could go one way. It's very promising. We don't know for sure yet because it hasn't been deployed. But this is the kind of path that the United States and Israel work very well on, walk together on, with the Israeli, not only innovation, but Israel's ability, because of its circumstances, to act as a lab for testing out these things in real operational conditions. And there are far, far more examples, such as tunnels, which the United States is extremely interested in tunnel detection because of drug smugglings, because things are happening in between North and South Korea. So we have, again, I repeat this, but it's very important to understand not only a close alliance, but a close correlation of interest in a lot of things. And I think most people in Congress are very clear on that.
Yeah, it's so indicative. Everything you just laid out is so indicative of Israel's approach to challenges. When threats from Gaza started with the rockets, we created Iron Dome. After that, we saw tunnels were the next threat. We created the tunnel technology. Now we're working on the laser beam. All of these things in collaboration with the United States, and just promising us that we'll be able to maintain our security, and the fact that we know that the United States is behind us and making sure that that's the way that things will be maintained. So
I think that's a perfect way to put it, and I think I assume you have the same experience. But for me as a mother, to be shelled, but to know that it will be okay, as scary as it is for the children, as traumatic as it can be in times, that the threat to their actual lives, if they do everything they're told to do, and if we're following directions, is so minute compared to what it could be because of Israeli technology and U.S. support. Again, it's a real demonstration of how it affects our lives as civilians here in Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Helit, this topic is so expansive and can sometimes be quite overwhelming. So we really appreciate the time that you've taken today to sit with us and give us a specific and analytical overview of what's going on. And we really appreciate all of your work. So thank you so much.
Very happy to talk to you.